China to stop burning dinosaurs for fun. Just under 30.
Hi, I'm Tyler False. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Today we're going to be looking at one of thoughty2's videos called Renewable Energy is the Scam We All Fell For. Man, the first thing that comes to mind with that are all of those spam calls you get about installing solar panels on your roof or switching your energy plan to all wind energy, that sort of thing. Not sure if that's what he's talking about, but those are the first types of scams that I think I've associated with renewable energy. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm going for renewables. Well, I am a nuclear engineer, but I also have a fair amount of background in renewable energy, wind and solar specifically. That's actually what my minor was in college. And I've done a few projects associated with renewables. Let's take a look.
Hey, thoughty2 here. This is Hornsey Project 1, a wind farm currently under construction off the coast of Yorkshire. When it is completed in 2020, it will be the largest wind farm in the world. It will power 1 million homes, but this project will collectively cost consumers in the UK an additional £4.2 billion on their energy bills. That's fine, I guess, if it's going to save the planet. But is it? Really? It turns out
a lot of people mention the whole renewables saving the planet sort of deal. It will help mitigate the effects of global climate change, but that's always been one of those pretty exaggerated sort of things. At least compared to when I think of save the planet, I think of Star Wars, you know, blowing up the Death Star to stop it from actually destroying your planet. But that's just my thoughts. But renewables, they do have a part to play, but they can't do it by themselves.
That renewable energy isn't as rosy as we have all been sold.
Says that it makes the screen rosy.
Scientists believe that climate change is real and it's an issue we need to face today. It's estimated that the effects of climate change will kill at least 150 million people this century. All of these premature deaths could be avoided if the average global temperature could just be reduced by 1.5 degrees Celsius.
That's an interesting stat. I might have to cross-check that. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head for the effects of global climate change, but is it for the 1.5 degree scenario, the 2.5 degree snenario, and what specifically counts as a climate change death? Associated with all the heat waves, the severe weather that pops up, like hurricanes, especially where I live in Texas, associated with global climate change. So while I do believe that that climate change has that potential to get crazy and for there to be lives lost associated with it, it'd be interesting to know where you can cross that number from and what counts and what doesn't. I really don't know.
Hippies spend their lives doing two things: dyeing their hair and getting angry at governments for their apparent lack of action on climate change. There are a very small number of countries, however, that have heard the message loud and clear and are leading the way on fixing the planet's thermostat by investing billions into renewable energy. The most prominent is Germany. Today, between 40 to 50% of Germany's energy comes from renewables such as wind, solar and hydro.
That's a vulnerable grid right there. 40 to 50%. Renewables can do a lot, but when you're relying on things that aren't on most of the time, we need better energy storage if you're going to try to get those to work. It's plausible with better energy storage, but we are not there yet. Wonder what the grid's like in Germany.
Germany, then, is making an exemplary move in the right direction, aren't they? Well, let's take a closer look at Germany's most popular renewable choice, wind power. Wind turbines are fantastic for reducing CO2 emissions, we all know that. Building wind turbines, on the other hand, does actually produce a huge amount of CO2 to smelt and manufacture the humongous steel bodies and aluminium blades. But once it's up and running, a wind turbine pays off its CO2 debt within 5 months.
How long till they pay off their financial debt?
So it's not really an issue.
I'll give you a hint, it's longer than 5 months.
That a low carbon footprint is just about the only benefit of wind turbines. They kill endangered species of birds quicker than the Duke of Wellington on New Year's Day. Hundreds of thousands of birds are killed by wind turbines every year, and thousands of those are rare species of large birds like eagles. Over 1 million bats are also killed each year by wind turbine blades, and solar has its own unique issue.
So he does mention the bird kills. It's a lot, but it doesn't kill nearly as many birds as cats. With humans domesticating cats, you can argue that cats can be somewhat of a human impact on birds because humans like cats. They're good to cuddle. I like cuddling cats, but yeah, cats kill a lot more birds than those wind turbines. I'll share a link in a description, but I believe that number was on the order of millions.
Mainly toxic waste. Well-made solar panels have a lifespan of 20 to 25 years.
That is really good.
But with their huge and growing popularity, cheaply made Chinese solar panels are flooding global markets. These can break down in as little as 5 years, and many of them contain highly toxic chemicals that are harmful to human health and can cause cancer, such as lead, cadmium, and chromium.
So I'm looking at this video 4 years ago. That might not have existed back then, but a bit of an update. There are some types of solar panels that there is a seal of approval, kind of like those equal exchange, fair trade things that you see on like chocolate bars and stuff, that this solar panel was made ethically. Also kind of like when you get diamonds to verify that they're not blood diamonds, that sort of thing. The solar industry has come under a lot of scrutiny from that sort of thing, and that's one thing that a lot of big solar companies are looking to correct. So they indeed have, one, just higher quality solar panels, like he said, and two, that the solar panels themselves don't have the horrific human conditions that are associated with making them.
Unlike nuclear waste, the toxicity of these elements never decays. All solar panels can...
Interesting. Wow. First time I think I've seen another YouTuber reference nuclear waste, albeit in a somewhat unrelated video, I might add, talking about renewables as the positive alternative to a different form of waste. That's cool.
It can do so with varying degrees of regularity. When the glass is smashed, toxic chemicals can leach into the soil and thus public water supplies. Also, we have no plan to dispose of these mountains of broken solar panels safely. The vast majority of solar panels will be shipped off to countries that have no safe way of dealing with their toxicity. Countries where we already send millions of tons of our tech waste.
They're not recyclable. He's right about that.
Africa and other developing regions. These are teething issues that will hopefully be fixed by better decommissioning protocols and pipelines and improved solar technology.
Yeah.
Both solar and wind, however, have an inescapable issue that no amount of technology can fix. They only produce energy when the wind blows or the sun shines.
That's true.
In some locations,
fundamental to how they work.
As little as 10% of the time. And yes, we've built wind farms in those locations. Even the most efficient wind and solar farms only work optimally 30% of the time. Although, to be clear,
that's actually
most
decently good for wind and solar.
Some amount of energy, around 75% of the time, even if it is just a little. This means we will always need a more consistent energy source, such as fossil or nuclear, to cover renewables downtime.
Again, mentioning nuclear in a positive way, I love it. Again, better energy storage, smart grid management systems can help with that in terms of getting the energy when it's needed and where it's needed. But he is absolutely right. You can't. It's fundamental to how wind and solar work that they're only producing energy some of the time. But the idea is to keep some of them in the grid. Just think of really big batteries. Think of it as really big batteries that to store the energy and move it during times of peak demand.
Perhaps in the future, battery technology will reach a point where it becomes feasible to store copious amounts of excess power from renewable sources, and then the grid can be fed off those whilst the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. But currently, the technology isn't even close. As it stands, no battery array in the world can hold even a fraction of the power needed to sustain a city for more than a few minutes. The current largest array, built by Tesla in Australia, is a 100 megawatt array that can sustain 30,000 homes for an hour. In fact,
that's pretty good for batteries, though, because most batteries you just think of like putting your car on. You don't really think of batteries powering homes, but it'll be interesting to see this technology get more and more advanced.
Without having huge and expensive battery arrays dotted around every country, which would be an eyesore, solar and wind have seemingly insurmountable redundancy issues. Fossil and nuclear power plants both work within a similar framework. The fuel produces heat, which is used to create steam, which turns a large turbine, which turns a generator, which creates electricity.
There you go. That's really it. Nuclear power is just a different way to boil water.
And when I say large turbine, I mean stupidly large. These Goliaths usually weigh in at over 100 tons of solid steel. Its immense mass has some benefits, primarily...
That right there was just one turbine. The plant that I had 4 in series that were like that, going from high pressure down to low pressure with... bits of steam extracted from feed water heaters and to optimize efficiency and just keep the pressure on the turbine hot, keep the hot part as hot as you can and the cold part as cold as you can, being the condenser. Maximize efficiency. Again, like you said, that concept though is not unique to nuclear. It exists in so-called thermal plants, coal plants, natural gas plants. That's what you do.
Redundancy. Nuclear power plants produce energy 24/7, 365 days.
Except during when refueling,
they are only shut down once every 2 years to refuel.
Some are on an 18-month fuel cycle. The one I was at was...
But what if it has to shut down in an emergency? What if it fails and stops producing steam to turn the turbine? Actually, what if every single fossil fuel and nuclear power plant in the country all shut down at the same time for some reason?
Good luck getting power back online for something like that.
The power would go out, right? Well, not quite. You see, because of the immense inertial mass of a spinning turbine, there is enough centrifugal force to maintain its rotation and continue to generate power as normal for a couple of minutes without any steam input. This gives the national grid a small yet crucial time to restart the power plant and get it back online.
Okay, wow. I think I might actually have to correct someone for saying nuclear is actually better than it is. So everything he said is true about the inertia from a turbine. Well, but the turbine is coasting down, so you're losing... It's not at 100% that entire period. Depending on when the emergency shutdown was, if you're at 100% power, it could take the majority of an hour for it to fully coast down. But it's going to start coasting down, and you're going to start losing. But it's going to start coasting down right away. The generator trips. Not the turbine. The turbine is still spinning down, but the actual generator that's connected to the grid. So everything from the grid is gone. At least in a nuclear plant, that's how it works. It's completely divorced from the grid right away. Yes, that momentum still exists in the turbine, but it's not being connected to the grid at all. And let's say it takes, even if it took a full hour to coast down, you're not restarting a nuclear power plant back up in an hour. So administratively, the fastest turnaround I've seen in my career is less than 48 hours for getting it to restart. And this assumes like the cause of the reactor trip or the grid issue was known and corrected immediately, and everything and nothing went wrong. That's actually fairly normal. That nothing at least associated with the reactor plant breaks after the reactor is tripped. But there are limits associated with how quickly you can restart a reactor. There's investigations. They can be quick. investigations, management oversight, certain permissions you need to get from more senior people at the site before you can even attempt to do so. And after that, then there's just a matter of physically doing it. There are limits associated with how quickly you can ramp up reactor power. Unfortunately, nuclear power plants can't turn around on a dime like that. Now, nuclear submarines, they're a different story. There's even a term for that known as a fast recovery startup, that they can actually restart that quickly to get the sub moving. But that's a completely different design. But I really like that he's, saying good things about nuclear, but they're not quite that good that they can restart on a dime in less than an hour. It would be cool though. Man, you could save a lot of money with forced outages.
Because of this crucial redundancy window, unplanned power outages due to hiccups at power plants are extremely rare. Most power cuts happen due to weather affecting other parts of the infrastructure.
He's right about it being rare.
Cables. Wind turbines don't have a large turbine to rely on if it fails. It just stops producing power instantaneously. So does a solar farm. Although there is currently hype surrounding new hybrid wind turbines that have a backup battery in the base of the tower, which will help overcome this issue somewhat. But then...
Though I will say, the thing about wind and solar is you could just lose an individual row of arrays for solar or an individual turbine for a wind farm. So that... you can lose one thing without losing the entire facility. Whereas the nuclear plant I worked at had 2 units, 2 reactors. So you lose one, then you're down to half. But nuclear power plants are way less vulnerable to these sort of power disruptions that you would see from wind and solar. So this sort of thing doesn't happen nearly as often, like you said.
There's an issue of land usage and the environment.
Yeah.
To build these huge arrays of wind turbines and solar panels, an area of over 5,000 square meters usually has to be cleared of all vegetation and wildlife. This is disastrous for the ecosystem, the local environment, and the poor various species that may call it home. To power a country such as the United Kingdom, using exclusively wind and solar power, it is estimated that up to 25% of the country's land surface would have to be cleared and transformed into wind or solar farms. Wind farms only return 2.5 watts per square meter. Compare that to nuclear, which produces 1,000 watts per square meter, and it's clear how inefficient renewables are when it comes to land usage. We could mitigate some of this disastrous loss of nature by building all of these wind farms offshore.
And it's sea usage.
Although we still don't fully understand the long-term effects of offshore wind farms on marine species. But this isn't actually...
Offshore wind is way more susceptible to the weather, like tides. The ocean's a high-energy environment, so you have to periodically do maintenance on the pedestals that hold them together. I'm not saying offshore wind isn't viable necessarily. The weather effects on offshore wind is even more extreme.
Sure, we're building offshore wind farms, but the UK currently has 271 farms planned over the next decade. About half of them are currently under construction. But only 25 of these will be offshore. Although it's worth considering that the offshore arrays do tend to be far larger than their land counterparts. There's an important philosophical question to be answered here though. By destroying huge swathes of nature to build renewables, aren't we destroying the very natural world that renewables are intended to save?
Possibly.
But what about the cost of human life caused by direct accidents?
Some people think they're pretty.
Meltdowns.
The wind farms.
Surely this is one area in which renewables can win hands down. Well, the figures may shock you, as they shocked me. The most dangerous are, as to be expected, the fossil fuels.
Yep.
Coal tops the figures with 100,000 deaths per petawatt hour.
That's a lot.
Then oil at 36,000, then biomass with 24,000 deaths, natural gas at 4,000.
One thing that people keep mentioning about renewables being safe, they forget that biomass is lumped in with renewables. It ain't terribly safe or environmentally friendly. You're burning wood or something, it's just going to go in the atmosphere. But it is renewable.
And that's not factoring in the millions of deaths each year as a result of the air pollution from all of these sources. But it's the carbon neutral energy sources that have the most interesting figures. Hydro, 1,400. Also, hydro secretly produces quite a large amount of CO2. Solar, 440 deaths, and wind, 150. Although there are no completely reliable data sources for wind turbine deaths, more data is needed.
Figured wind would actually be higher than solar, but solar is a bit more common. Because wind, doing maintenance on those turbines, that's anything with working at heights, people fall off these, or people fall off wind turbines, and also in the case of solar, people fall off our roofs. That's where a lot of these deaths are coming from. Also associated with with shocks. It's anything associated with electricity does have that risk. So I've had people come to me surprised that like wind and solar having less deaths than nuclear, but it's fairly comparable, and that's just because there's deaths associated with any sort of industrial environment.
It's what's at the very bottom of the list, however, that may shock you. Nuclear is just 90 deaths per petawatt hour.
Yeah, comparable to solar and wind.
And that includes Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. Nuclear.
A lot of people don't know this. 3 Mile Island, no direct deaths. I did a short on this a while ago, talking about the fear of nuclear from things like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, causing people to build more coal plants, and that causing deaths associated from these accidents, which is an interesting way to look at it.
Energy has a really bad public image. It's no surprise, with its association with nuclear warheads and Chernobyl, but you can't ignore statistics. And it is statistically the safest form of reliable power production.
Even if you include deaths from nuclear warheads, including the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the deaths would still be less than coal. Because using that figure he did, talking about per petawatt hour, well, that's going to figure out to about 200,000 deaths per year from coal, which is more than the people that died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after just 1 year. So even if you didn't include that, coal is still more deadly. Coal being more deadly than nuclear weapons is fascinating. Now, we didn't use that many nuclear weapons, but still.
We have today. Nuclear energy and negative press go together like Greenpeace and propaganda. And so there are many countries that have been decommissioning nuclear reactors in favour of renewable sources. But in an ironic twist of fate, nuclear may just be the energy source that could save our planet. Nuclear fission is big and scary, but it has so many benefits that cannot simply be ignored. Nuclear power plants produce 0 carbon emissions. Their only byproduct is nuclear waste, but unlike byproducts of...
Thank you for not showing the yellow barrels when you mentioned nuclear waste. They have labels on there that say radioactive, and that's one of those OSHA labels that you do see. But yeah, not showing the yellow barrels with the big giant radioactive symbol that takes up half the barrel.
The other forms of energy production, this is 100% contained and doesn't leak out into the environment. Nuclear waste can also be recycled and be used in reactors multiple times. It's important to note, however...
He's specifically talking about spent fuel. It can be reprocessed, or even a lot of times it can just be within the same pool in the same nuclear plant. At the nuclear plant that I worked at, there were fresh fuels, once burned and twice burned. And you can orient the core in such a way, it's just like playing a game of Scrabble, really, and how you orient the fresh, the single burn, twice burn, where you place the sources, where you place the control rods. That it's pretty common to make nuclear power plants with once and twice burned fuel. It's pretty cool.
The uranium mining and enrichment processes do use fossil fuels,
yes,
and this does produce a lot of CO2.
And building nuclear plants, any heavy construction industry, use a lot of concrete to make buildings, so it costs carbon emissions to build things, but the amount of energy that nuclear produces offsets that pretty quick.
But when we average it out over a power plant's life cycle, a single nuclear reactor and all its related industries produces a median of 65 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour.
You mentioned life cycle. So in the US, a license for a nuclear plant is 40 years. Compare that to, say, a top-of-the-line wind farm. 20 years is pretty good. A lot of them are 10 or even less, but wind can get pretty good, and even the same with some type of solar panels. That's top of the line. Now 40, that's just the base license. A license extension of 20 years to 60 is fairly common, and even a further one to 80 is being discussed. There have even been heads of industry that an extension of all the way to 100 years isn't completely off the table. Now, a license renewal process is rigorous. It does involve reviews by the federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. A lot of engineering calculations need to be done. A lot of maintenance needs to be done to ensure the plant can go for another 20 years. And a lot of times these extensions are conditional on certain large-scale, multi-million-dollar maintenance projects being done. That is way cheaper than building a brand new nuclear plant.
That's roughly the same amount of CO2 produced by wind farms over their life cycle, taking their manufacturing and regular maintenance into consideration as well.
Yeah.
But nuclear's carbon footprint could be even lower than wind. Allow me to expand. Since 1987, Russia and the US have been mutually decommissioning their nuclear warheads. Even if recent political hiccups have put a spanner in the process, every year old nuclear warheads are still regularly retired and decommissioned. This creates a steady influx of already highly enriched uranium.
Not sure why he's showing some biohazard. That's some vial with a virus of some sort. I hope we don't have any weapons like that.
Fuel that can be used in nuclear power plants to create energy, completely bypassing the uranium mining and enrichment processes, and thus bypassing CO2 emissions altogether. Skeptics believe that nuclear power plants lead to nuclear weapon proliferation. But, in fact, it's the complete opposite.
It's interesting someone showing this side of the argument. You don't see very often. So proliferation is all about decisions and priorities. Uranium and plutonium are produced in nuclear power, but it's just how we use them. I love the idea of essentially reverse reprocessing to, I guess, de-rich? What's the opposite of enrich? Weapons-grade uranium and plutonium to make nuclear fuel for nuclear power plants. That's a really cool idea.
The absolute best way to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world is by building more nuclear reactors. In 2013, 19% of the world's nuclear energy
That's the picture of uranium I usually use.
By uranium-235 from decommissioned nuclear weapons. Let's take a look at two real-life countries that have taken completely opposite paths when it comes to energy. Germany has invested heavily into renewables and has decommissioned 17 of their nuclear reactors, and Merkel's government pledged to remove all of their nuclear reactors by 2022.
That's just so
today,
sad.
Only 6% of Germany's power comes from nuclear. At the opposite end of the scale, France has invested heavily in nuclear as its primary source of power. They currently have 58 active reactors, and more than 80% of France's energy needs are met by nuclear. By far the highest per capita in the world.
Yes.
The result? Germany's CO2 emissions per capita are double that of France.
That's just interesting. And with France, some of it was their relative lack of resources. It's like, if you don't have any resources in your environment that's naturally going to work, nuclear can work anywhere, which is cool. By resources, I mean, like...
And French households enjoy a much lower energy cost as well. They pay only €0.1799 per kilowatt hour. Germans pay almost double that for their electricity, 0.3.
Is he going to talk about the scammers?
Hour. The second highest in Europe. Notably, Germany's energy costs have increased by 50% since starting their big push towards renewables. I'm not trying to actively disparage renewables. I think they have an important part to play in saving the planet. But I believe it should be a far smaller part than what we are currently aiming for, if for no other reason than to not see our world's beautiful landscapes littered with gigantic obnoxious windmills.
That's funny. So I guess he didn't talk about the scammers, but those little energy plans when selecting your energy portfolio, for lack of a better term, when choosing your energy provider. Some of those you have the option to pay more for like 100% wind energy or 100% renewables or something like that. But those things crack me up because it's connected to a grid and no one is going in and stamping each electron you are getting to verify it is coming from wind and solar. That's the part that just fascinates me because it's just grid. It's a function of grid capacity and grid demand and everything being plugged in parallel. All your generators of all types in parallel. It's all mixed. That whole scheme just, if you think about it, really doesn't make any sense.
Not if there is no overwhelming benefit over the alternative. Humanity's cleanest, cheapest form of energy has been right in front of us since the 40s. And until nuclear fusion comes along, we should be investing more in nuclear fission to prevent greenhouse gases without needing to destroy thousands of square miles of our beautiful planet to litter it with bird blenders.
The other thing that takes the cake is not only are those big, the wind turbines, they're not recyclable either. So yeah, you really have to think long and hard about, that's one other misconception is that but they don't last as long as nuclear. And so maybe do a multiplier by your best case scenario is a factor of 2 with a top-of-the-line wind turbine at 20 years and a nuclear plant that, for whatever reason, never gets its license extension past 40. So put that in your calculation when you consider land use.
But what if nuclear energy could be improved even further? What if it could produce little to no waste and be completely safe and meltdown-proof? Well, maybe it can. In 1950, Indian physicist Homi Bhabha postulated that perhaps another fuel from the typical uranium-235 and plutonium-239 could be used for nuclear fission. Thorium. Thorium is a naturally occurring radioactive metal that is 4 times as abundant on Earth as uranium. After World War II, a reactor design that used thorium as its fuel, a molten salt reactor, was created by the US government.
Now, molten salt reactors are going to have their own type of challenges. Namely, they use molten salt, so you have to make it. You have to keep it safe. You don't want it to come into contact with water because that reaction can be explosive. All things that can be done. One thing to point out is you don't necessarily need a molten salt reactor to utilize thorium, but this is kind of the most common example that has a tendency to show up. That thorium and molten salt reactors are one of the same. Not all molten salt reactors use thorium. Not all thorium is required to use molten salt. But that's one thing that I often see people lump together. But you don't necessarily have to. We can have an even more diverse fuel source.
And the first experimental reactor of its kind was built at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And it successfully generated electricity between 1965 and 1969. But the US government decided that the future of nuclear energy was in uranium, not thorium. And so pretty much every reactor in the world since the 60s has used uranium fuel.
Part of the reason for that is initially before the 60s, we thought uranium was a more scarce resource, but since uranium is more readily available, decided to go that route.
There were many reasons for uranium being chosen
as
a
cool diagram.
de facto fission fuel over thorium. But one of the most prominent was that uranium makes much better bombs. Uranium enrichment plants produce
you can't make a bomb with
uranium that can either be used in nuclear warheads or to power people's homes. Thorium, on the other hand, can be used to make nuclear weapons, but it's a lot more difficult and more inefficient. But that's not the only
If you're going to do that, you need to combine it with plutonium, and plutonium is your main active ingredient there. So thorium can be used to extend a reaction, but it's not your primary source of what can make a bomb.
Benefit of thorium-based power over uranium. Thorium reactors produce much less nuclear waste. One Chinese scientist claims that there will be 1,000 times less nuclear waste from thorium reactors. Also, since natural thorium can be used directly as a fuel, it does not need to be enriched. And it gets better. Another thorium reactor design, known as liquid fluoride thorium reactor.
So the thorium doesn't have to be enriched, that's true, but you need to combine it with plutonium because it's not the thing that directly causes your fission by itself. So that's the proliferation concern with thorium, that you have to combine it with plutonium. That also adds its own other cost source. Those of you guys have seen my salmonella video, reaction videos of his one on thorium, which is hilarious, by the way. You'll know that I'm still a proponent of seeing thorium. I would love to see more thorium reactors. I'd love to see more uranium reactors.
Or LIFTR has a unique
liquid fluoride,
design that its proponents claim is meltdown proof. You see, the most common cause of reactor meltdowns in current uranium plants is excessively high and runaway temperatures, usually due to power failures which can lead to insufficient cooling.
So temperatures, usually it's from decay heat, not the actual fission. In the case like Fukushima, the reactors, they shut down all the reactors safely in a matter of seconds. So had nothing to do with the reactor being critical or anything like that. It was more the entire area was destroyed, including all of their on-site emergency generators, and the fission products of the fuel, the uranium, still generate heat. So they just continued to generate heat after it was shut down. I know that's what he said about loss of power sources, but that's just one clarification that I wanted to be sure gets captured. I've seen some misconceptions that it's because they're unable to shut down the reactor. That's not the case. That's not what caused Fukushima.
But lifters contain a plug at the bottom of the reactor that is designed to melt if the temperature gets too high. This causes all the fuel to drain into an underground safe storage tank, which, in theory, should completely avert a catastrophic meltdown.
So he's referring to passive safety systems, and that is really cool. With a freeze plug, completely safely shuts it down. That isn't the only type of reactor that has that meltdown proof feature. Some small modular reactors can also have that feature as well. Keep in mind the meltdown, very, very low probability, and with diverse, redundant, physically separated power supplies for the safety injection system, at least in pressurized water reactors, but very, very low probability of happening. But it is cool to see something that completely takes it out of the equation.
It all seems too good to be true. And science writer Richard Martin certainly thinks so. He writes, "Thorium could provide a clean and effectively limitless source of power while allaying all public concern, weapons proliferation, radioactive pollution, toxic waste, and fuel that is both costly and complicated to process."
That could be cool. The biggest problem is just letting the public concern, because most people hear the word nuclear associated with anything that they immediately assume that it's either a bomb or it's an accident waiting to happen. So even if the technology is, as in the public eye, miraculous, a lot of people might not believe it. That's always the challenge associated with anything nuclear.
But like everything in life, thorium isn't short of its detractors. There are some who argue that because thorium is still highly experimental and it hasn't been operational on a large scale like uranium reactors have, it can't yet be trusted, and it may not be all it's being made out to be.
That's what is right, yeah.
But I guess the only way we can find out for certain whether thorium is the golden goose of clean energy is by putting it into use. And that's exactly what India is doing right now. India has one of the largest
supplies
of thorium. And they have pledged
Everything
to meet
nuclear.
30% of their energy demands with thorium reactors by 2050.
Cool.
Britain, France, Canada, America, China, and a few others are currently looking into thorium as a potential energy source.
I'd love to see thorium
India
reactors.
is currently the only country that has a well thought out, government approved and funded plan to ramp up thorium-based energy production. India plans to have over 60 functional thorium reactors by 2025. And since India is
Tick-tock. It's 2023 right now. India just has one test reactor. That'd be cool. Seeing 60 commercial reactors all built in the span of 2 years.
the world's third largest polluter, it seems like a necessary step that could help preserve the planet for a little while longer. But it's going to require action from more than just one country to save our planet. To be completely honest, the world needs to look towards China to stop burning dinosaurs for fun. Just under 30% of the world's carbon emissions come from China. It's not surprising since a staggering 55% of power production in China is coal-based. A tiny 4% of China's power comes from nuclear, as of 2018.
I'd like to see more of that.
I'm not saying we should abandon all forms of energy except nuclear. Wind and solar renewables have a huge and beneficial part to play in saving the planet. But all nations should be looking to eradicating coal-based energy production. It's horrendously inefficient. You have to burn a load of coal and release a ton of CO2 for a pathetic return of energy. It kills millions of people each year from pollution, and it's quickly killing the planet too. But perhaps as most developed nations are looking to replace coal power, nuclear shouldn't simply be swept aside for renewables. Renewables may be the fashionable and popular option, but that doesn't necessarily make it the better option. Thanks for watching.
I would argue that nuclear power makes renewable energy sustainable. I couldn't find it, but otherwise I'd share it with this video. There was an old comic, a nuclear comic someone showed me about the nuclear power plant powering a giant fan to make wind turbines economically viable. I don't think renewable energy is a scam, other than that one scam I just talked about. But I would still like to see more wind and solar working together with nuclear power. But we need more nuclear power, more importantly than we need more renewables. Small modular reactors would be a fun way to do it. I'd love to see thorium. I'd love to see fusion, but that one I'm not going to hold my breath on. And please, if you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to join me on a journey to a clean, safe, sustainable nuclear energy future. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.